What's up, y'all? Let's dive headfirst into today's stories. I was working in a finance company last year. One day, I proposed to my manager that since I have a computer programming background, I know that for that manual job XYZ, automation can be done using some new tech and it'll reduce 500 man-hours per week. He also has some tech background, so he says it hasn't been done because it can't be done, and behaved with condescension. I, being bullheaded and with poop to prove, and CV to build, developed it on my own, in my own time, on my home computer, then compiled it into a binary, single executable file without code, and gave it to him. He got permission from IT department to run it on his computer and was utterly sure that it won't work and he would get to laugh at me, but it did. Even though the software works, idiot manager took it as an insult somehow and banned me from using it, giving some inane reason that doing it manually was much more effective, which was a bummer because it was working beautifully. Fast forward a quarter or so, my manager was hard pressed for some brownie points during appraisal, so in examples of showing initiative he used my software, but without mentioning me. Some super senior manager took notice and gave him a promotion and a raise. Now, instead of being a sensible guy and coming clean to get code from me, he calls me in his cabin, behaves rudely and says that I need to submit the code for that software. I asked him why. You said we won't be using it? He's like, either you submit the code or you'll be fired. I was already fed up of being treated like poop by this crap stain, just because he was somehow jealous. So I said, duck off, I won't submit the code, I know enough law to know that you can't sue me, and I resign. I came to know later through my colleagues that this is what he must have wanted, so that he could take the entire credit himself without dispute. Little did he know, there was a malicious code module hidden in that executable file, which checked for a 1 or 0 on a remote GitHub repository every time it was run. If 1 or no network, do everything as required, but if a 0 is received, that's emergency signal. I added that little code because his behavior was very crafty to begin with and I didn't trust him. I was planning to remove it after its official implementation, which never happened. So I went ahead and changed that 1 to 0 after I was fired, to ensure no one used it without my permission. Although he couldn't get the code, he did have the executable file, and I was also not in the company anymore, so in his arrogance, he called a meeting with his boss, his colleagues and my whole team, to show them a demo of this awesome software he had made. He was using it on his laptop every day without my knowledge. But today the 1 was 0, so as soon as he pressed enter, nothing happened, pressed enter again, nada. Suddenly his laptop was frozen and nothing was working anymore. It took him a while to realize something fishy was going on, and then he took out the laptop battery to switch it off. By then, all the Word, Excel and PowerPoint files were encrypted and the executable had erased itself out of existence. I used the same code, without the malicious module, to get a better job at another company, where I'm much more appreciated and the job is also fun. Then the whole COVID thing happened and now I'm cozily working from my home. My previous colleagues of that crafty company keep telling me that they are being forced to go to office. So somehow it was the best decision I had made accidentally. That idiot boss's promotion and raise got cancelled because he couldn't produce what he promised. He also got reprimanded for losing a lot of important company data, which he attributed to some unknown virus, which wasn't believable because no one's allowed to put anything on those office laptops without security clearance from IT debt. He called me one night, drunk, angry, threatening me that he knows what I did. I feigned ignorance and quoted something like poop happens to crafty people and blocked his number. But I had to tell someone about this flawless victory over stupid, without being implicated, so here it is. So I'm a gay man, though it took me a long time to actually come to terms with it. During the time when I was questioning my sexuality, I was dating who I thought was a lovely girl. I'll call her Jane. I genuinely loved her and pictured us having a future together, as we'd been dating for 3 years and had started to get pretty serious, even though we were only 18 when he split us up. You lot know what young love is like. Anyway, the only other important people in this story are my ex-best friend James and my absolutely incredible boyfriend Alex. James and I had been friends since we were about 10 or 11 and we got close, to the point that we felt more like brothers than best friends. He was really supportive of my relationship with Jane and would constantly talk about how glad he was that she made me happy. Though when I look back on it now, he had a habit of constantly talking about how gorgeous she was, how sexy she was and how I was such a lucky guy. I understand the last one, but he was a bit excessive when he talked about how attractive Jane was, but I was young and naive at the time and didn't think anything of it. That was, until I caught them. I'm not much of a writer, but essentially I noticed that they were both becoming pretty possessive over their phones. They'd randomly disappear claiming to be feeling ill or having to get some project done, and, I know it sounds stupid, but I kept noticing that the condoms I was buying were going missing. I always liked to make sure we had enough for precautions. I wound up going to Jane's house one day when she'd bailed on me claiming to have a migraine. I was partly worried for her health and brought some painkillers, food and some bottled water in case she genuinely did feel ill, but I also had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that she was lying to me. I don't know how to explain it, I just knew. Sure enough, when I let myself in with the spare key she'd given me, I found her in bed with James. I was heartbroken. The two people who I cared about most in the world and who I thought cared about me went behind my back like this. I was furious. We had a major argument. Jane begged me to listen to her whilst James yelled at me, and I eventually just stormed out. I wanted to go and tell everyone what they'd done and shame them for it. But that's where the problem arose. Remember at the start where I mentioned that I was questioning my sexuality? James knew about it. Of course he knew I'd never leave Jane to sleep with a bunch of guys, but he was fully aware that I'd figured out that I was attracted to guys and girls. More like just Jane in particular, as I don't really feel any attraction towards girls anymore. And he used this against me. He knew full well how terrified I was that my parents would disown me, and he made sure to remind me that if I didn't keep my mouth shut then my parents would find out. At the time this was absolutely terrifying, though I now know that they accept me 100% and still love me. So I kept my mouth shut. I was stuck having to work with James at his father's garage, as I couldn't come up with a way to explain how I was mad at him without letting everyone know what he did and risking getting outed to my parents. Besides, I needed the money and there weren't a whole lot of other jobs I could apply for. Also, I really should mention that James was going out of his way to harass me at work, calling me a bunch of slurs whenever he got the chance, pushing me around and just generally reminding me that he could tell my parents at any point. I got really low at this point, and the only time I actually felt sort of content to just let myself relax and be myself was when I'd go to the local gay bars. There was one club in particular that I loved to go to, a drag club, where I met my boyfriend Alex. He was a drag queen there and helped out behind the bar and stuff when he was needed. To save any confusion, I'm just gonna use he/him pronouns for him, though they do switch when he's in drag. We flirted for a few weeks before gradually becoming friends with benefits. He is amazing, and I know it sounds cheesy, but I was the happiest I'd ever been when he agreed to be my boyfriend. But that's skipping a little bit ahead. This revenge happened before we started dating, and we were still just friends who'd hook up every now and then. After a few months I finally worked up the courage to open up to Alex about what happened with Jane and James, and that's when an evil look fell over his face. See, Alex is the sweetest guy you could ever meet, but if you piss him off he can and will turn into an evil genius. Around this time James had been bragging to me that the ladies loved him and he could get any girl he wanted. I really doubt that. He'd always been kinda like this, but he upped the bragging in an attempt to annoy me. He also told me how any girl that I dated would leave me in an instant to sleep with him. So, Alex suggested we put that to the test. Cue the revenge. We started off small. See, James had given me his email address a few years prior and, just as I'd thought, he couldn't be bothered to change it. So I decided to be very generous and sign him up to a premium subscription to several gay porn websites, and decided to be courteous and agree to receive emails about notifications, new offers and other things he may be interested in, just to be nice and make sure he had some variety. Oh, did I mention that this was the email address he allowed his father to use? Oops. It cost me a fair bit of money, but I made sure that he got the best offers. Alex was more than happy to chip in to help me. It was worth it. When we were working in the garage and his dad stormed in and asked to speak to him. Now his dad didn't really give a poop about his kid being gay, but he was mortified that his son would order this much porn and put in their shared email address. He genuinely thought for months that James was a sex addict. We may have signed him up for a bit more than we thought. I logged into the email after the first 2 weeks of him being signed up for the subscriptions, and he had well over 100 emails about his accounts. This is when, like we'd hoped, James started getting more aggressive. He'd barge into me, screw up my work to get me in trouble, and send me disgusting messages, as well as threatening/insulting me in person. I took note of everything. I kept a notepad to log the dates and times of the incidents, and kept a detailed description of everything he did, every insult and every threat. I'd screenshot all the messages from him and record every insult and threat that he'd hurl at me on my phone. Alex helped me organize all of this onto files and then we saved it all onto a hard drive. This would be important for later. This is when we decided to move on to the next phase of our plan. The girlfriend. And no, not Jane. Also, I should mention that he and Jane split up only a couple of weeks after I found out about the affair. They were never gonna last. See, Alex passes extremely well when he's in drag, being feminine already makes it a bit easier. His voice isn't all that deep and he can sometimes be mistaken for a girl with a slightly deeper voice. He usually exaggerates his makeup and clothing, but for this phase of the plan we decided to get him to tone down the makeup slightly to make it appear more natural, and a mutual friend of ours took him aside and gave Alex some of her clothes to wear. We then created a fake Facebook account for my new girlfriend and Alex, and I posted some cute couple photos on this account and my own personal Facebook account, posting all your usual lovey-dovey stuff that you see on couples' social media. Then we put our plan into action. Alex would come to pick me up from work a couple days a week. Dressed as an extremely beautiful girl, if I do say so myself. We'd chat, hold hands, hug and kiss and just generally act like a couple. James obviously noticed. He took the bait and began chatting to Alex when he was waiting for me to finish up, and eventually wound up sending him, or our fake account, a friend request which Alex was all too happy to accept. It took a few weeks, but after a while of just talking about work, school, TV shows and music, James finally started to edge his and Alex's conversations into more sexual territory. Which was exactly what we were looking for. Alex answered accordingly. He had tried to send Alex nudes hoping to get some in return, but we deleted those straight away. We thought that would be a little too far, even for this douchebag. This continued for a few weeks until we had everything in place. Alex made sure to screenshot the messages, and then we went ahead and changed the name of the Facebook account to Alex's name and deleted the couple pictures on it. I sent the screenshots of the conversations with Alex to Jamie's friends. They were pretty accepting and usually were the ones to call James out when he was being an anus, and they took great pleasure in mocking James for it. The look on James' face when his friends mentioned his little boy toy was absolutely priceless. I'm not sure he'll ever live it down. The people he picked on at school even snapped back at him that he's the one who was sexting another guy, so where the hell did he get off calling them a FGGT? This pissed him off to no end, as he knew that they were right, even if he hadn't known Alex was a boy at the time. James also had the sort of expected reaction and started sending Alex a bunch of hateful messages and threats, only helping our case as we'd screenshot the messages and add it to the folders on the hard drive. Once I had what we thought was enough evidence, I decided to take it all to James' dad, mine and James' boss, and explained everything that was going on. From the cheating with Jane to the blackmail and threats, he just sat there and listened, allowing me to show him the proof I'd gathered. He did find the petty revenge with Alex and drag petty funny, but the rest of the time his face was just kind of blank, with a hint of anger in his eyes. He thanked me for the information and went off to speak with his son. James got fired on the spot. I agreed not to go to the police, as this could end up with some pretty bad press for his dad's company, and his dad was a pretty cool guy. I knew he was all talk, so there was no real threat of danger. I received an amazing reference from James' dad for a job I desperately wanted and eventually got, no doubt helped by said reference. James' parent flipped out with him. They refused to give him his job back and made him go out and actually put in the effort to get and keep a job. He had gotten used to being able to slack off, as his dad owned the place and technically couldn't fire him. They also sold the car they'd been letting him use and told him to pay for a new one with his own money. It took him about 2 years to save up enough money to buy his new car. It all eventually came out about James and Jane's affair. As for the threats of outing me, Alex kindly reminded James that he had absolutely no proof of me doing anything, whilst his friends all knew about the sexual messages James had sent him, you know, another guy. It would look like he was just pointing fingers because of a little petty revenge. James' father had also assured me that my secret was safe with him. So the threats of blackmail were now non-existent. James got into college on a scholarship and started hanging out with a bunch of other douchebags. I found out through a mutual friend that James was still a homophobic prick at college and was terrorizing a couple of LGBT students, as well as making disgusting threats against a lesbian girl in his class. None of them wanted to do anything about this, however. Why? Because James had been lying to them and saying that his dad was one of the higher-ups in the college or something. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention and I can't remember exactly who he said his father was, but it was enough to make these poor kids worry that they could be kicked out of college for speaking up about this. I decided to lend a helping hand, With the help of our mutual friend, I emailed a bunch of the disgusting screenshots, recordings of some of the threats and some of the homophobic/racist/sexist things he'd posted on his Facebook page, which he had deleted before the college could see them, to the higher-ups in the college. They were not happy with what they saw. They eventually revoked his scholarship after a few of the students, with some encouragement, spoke up about the harassment and threats. I honestly have no clue why he turned out like this. His parents are absolutely lovely, open-minded people. It's crazy. James' parents kicked him out after that. He stayed with his friends for a few months before he managed to get an apartment. Last I heard, he was working in a fast food restaurant, working to get into another college. I genuinely hope he bettered himself and that he can do well in his life. Everyone's capable of change, right? I'd also like to clarify that I didn't care all that much about getting back at Jane because, yes, she did have the affair, but I was getting some revenge on James for the blackmail and threats that came after it. Jane had showed me proof that she'd tried to prevent James from blackmailing me and told him to just let it go. If they'd both just stopped speaking to me after the affair, then this whole thing wouldn't have happened. I'd have been hurt and maybe a little awkward at work, but I wouldn't have went out of my way to get back at him. Though I did fill Jane's mother in on what actually happened and sent her some screenshots where Jane admitted to the affair. This was after I found out that she had told her mother that I was the one who cheated with a bunch of guys and girls, instead of the "we just grew apart" version that we'd agreed to tell our parents. From what I heard, her mother was not all that pleased with her. I also sent a few of the texts where she admitted to having an affair to her new boyfriend. Needless to say, he wasn't happy to find out that her abusive ex was actually just an ex who she'd cheated on. They're still together from what I heard, so all I can say to that guy is, good luck, my dude. I eventually did end up coming out to my parents and they were surprisingly supportive, which was amazing, and Alex and I got together a year or two after these events and we're still very much in love. What did you think? What would you have done differently? Share your opinions in the comments. And if you enjoyed the stories, slap that like and subscribe button for more of them, and don't forget to support the original writers with an upvote. Links are in the description. Peace out, and catch you tomorrow.